Well, there's a recognizable face if ever there was one. Clem Sunter has been advising South Africans about the future for decades now. What you might not know is that Clem was actually a top businessman. He ran Anglo American's gold and uranium division. At the time, that was the biggest gold producer in the world. He was also chairman of the Anglo American Chairman's Fund. But nowadays, known for his scenario planning, his writing, and much else. We're going to be picking up on the flags from Clem today. Clem, how many books have you written?
Well, including the Fox trilogy, which was actually 3 previous books, I think around 20. And, a few of them have been very successful. The first one, The World of South Africa in the 1990s, which introduced the whole high road, low road scenarios to South Africans in 1987. That was a really big hit. And, of course, we did take the high road in 1990 with the release of Mandela. So, yeah, that was probably the most successful book that I've written. But of course, all the research was done by very clever people in Anglo, like Michael O'Dowd and Bobby Godsall, and by a superb London team led by one of the great futurists in the world, Pierre Wack, a Frenchman who had been head of scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell. And I used that material to, write the book, which, hopefully influenced the debate in South Africa at the time on our future.
Not hopefully. Definitely did. And we have a lot to thank you for. But I got an email from somebody who asked to remain nameless, who was involved with you on writing a book. He said he had the most wonderful experience. And he said that you also donated your royalties to charity. Is that a normal thing? Surely booksellers, there's so little money that you make out of writing books. Donating it to charity seems one step too far.
Yeah, but that was before I retired from Anglo American formally in 2002. We were simply not allowed to earn external income, and I absolutely gave all the royalties of the books to charity before that. Yeah, but now I'm a genuine author.
Now you're an author. Well, and from the Fox trilogy. And the whole way of encouraging us to be more like foxes than hedgehogs. You've also developed flag watching. Just before we go into the update on the latest flags, would you explain the relevance or what it all means?
Yeah, I actually wrote this book in 2015 called Flag Watching because what people kept asking me was, okay, here are the scenarios, here are possible futures, but how am I to know which future is in play? And I realized that flags, to indicate which scenario was increasing in probability, were almost as important as the scenarios themselves. And so I then wrote this book where I said probably the first step before you actually get down to scenario writing is to establish what the real driving forces are changing the present into the future in the world today, and of course in South Africa, and if you're a company in your markets, before you actually get on to trying to imagine the future pathways that your country or your business can take. And so, when I facilitate a session now, I ask people, what are the flags that are currently changing your game, and what are the consequences that those flags could have? And it's a very revealing conversation because different people come up with different flags. And then obviously, once you've had that conversation, you can say, well, okay, now let's actually explore the future and see, what are the good scenarios flowing out of the flags and what are the bad scenarios.
Something very close to both of our hearts is the lack or the loss of skills in South Africa, the number of people who've left our country. Have you had many parents, grandparents, maybe the youngsters themselves who are looking for greener pastures, who've asked you to help them with flags, what flags they should be looking at?
Yeah, not really, Alec. I've obviously done work with companies both here and overseas, um, in terms of what the flags might be in Europe and America and Australia. But I've tried to keep away from giving people personal advice about whether they should stay or whether they should go. But one of the consistent flags I've always had is that the grey flag, which is of the aging of certain nations' population, plays a huge role in determining the future of that economy. Pierre Wack first drew my attention to that in 1988 when he said if property prices in Japan crash, it's never going to grow again because it's the oldest nation on earth. And of course, in 1990, that happened. And Japan went from a 7 to 8% per annum growth economy down to 0 to 0.5% growth. And the same is happening now in Europe, particularly in places like Greece and Italy, where the population is aging fast. It's happening in the UK. And now, of course, it's happening in China. Very critically, the Chinese population fell by 1 million people last year. From, and I know they've got 1.4 billion people, but that was a real flag that actually things might get tough in China. Whereas America is still a very young, resilient population because of its immigration policies, and equally India is a young population and could become the biggest economy in the world in the second half of the century. Africa and South America have young populations, but it really depends on the quality of government of each country as to whether that youthful population can be exploited to grow the economy.
And that's something that is maybe the most critical of your 5 flags for South Africa. And if we can hone in on it, the 2024 election, which could be a binary one.
Yeah. Well, I at the moment, and this was in the book that I wrote with Mitch Ilbery called Thinking the Future, which was published by Penguin 2 years ago, we offered 2 scenarios for South Africans. The people's economy, because the real challenge now is not to turn ourselves into a democracy. That was handled by Mandela and de Klerk back in the early 90s. And incidentally showed the real power of the leadership flag, which I talk about today. You, in many ways, you can't choose the leaders that are around you at the time. And we were just very fortunate to have 2 guys who actually got us to a democracy in the early 90s in South Africa. But now the challenge is the economy. We simply haven't got an economy that it reflects a democracy. We still have huge barriers between the mainstream economy and the downstream economies. And, there are plenty of barriers to young entrepreneurs trying to grow their businesses. So the positive scenario is that we concentrate on that in terms of the election and the parties that actually come out of the election as the government, that is the scenario that they have to take. And of course, the negative scenario is the cautionary tale scenario where, the kind of riots we had during the pandemic in KwaZulu-Natal become increasingly frequent. And we're on the slippery slide to a wasteland of misery. And I think it's the most opportune moment to offer those 2 scenarios and ask the political parties, what are you going to do to ensure that we develop an economy that we're proud of? And I think it's going to need a huge amount of support between government and the private sector to produce that economy. So one of the flags is whether we're going to see much greater discussions between the politicians and business people. I know they've started, but they've got to become really serious to create the entrepreneurial economy, which is one of my flags for the people's economy.
But when you talk about business people, almost by definition, those in big business are camped against entrepreneurship. They like the status quo. They like the fact that they have the power. They don't really want to see lots of little people nipping at their heels and taking away their business.
Yeah, no, you're quite right, and it's the case everywhere around the world. And of course, the other point is that big business, particularly in the kind of high tech area, buy out any small businesses that are possibly going to threaten them, so that they can get whatever new app or new device which that small business is developing. So, yeah, there is a natural tendency for big business and small business to be competing with each other in a way that is not good news for small business. But in the original work we did for the high road scenario, one of the points made was that Japan had a dual logic economy where the big businesses were actually in very close partnership with the small businesses. So Toyota, for example, was handing out the manufacture of all the individual parts of making a car to small businesses. And then they finally put those parts together and came up, with the proper branding of the car. And that kind of relationship between big and small business has to be part of the future of our economy. And yeah, we actually did start a project in the mid-90s in Anglo, where we went out and looked for small businesses around our mines that could produce stuff that we could use underground. It was called the Zemeli Project. And yeah, it worked, and it caused quite a few small businesses to go on and be fairly prosperous and have other clients as well. That is the kind of partnership we need too between big business and small business.
Anglo was so far ahead of its time, and hopefully now people are starting to appreciate. That's just one example. Did you, as an aside, read Michael Cardo's biography on Harry Oppenheimer?
I've read parts of it, and yeah, it's absolutely, yeah, he was a great guy. And one of the great things about Harry Oppenheimer was that he was not only an entrepreneur, he had that sort of real instinct for whether an investment was a good one or a bad one. And he used to, give his opinion to the Anglo executive on whether he thought one of the investments at play was a good idea or a bad idea. But also, he was one of those few heads of companies that stuck their head above the parapet before we became a democracy and said apartheid is an evil system and we really must get rid of it and we really must get back in the world. So I must say I had an incredible pleasure working for the company when he was involved in it.
I've heard it often being said. In fact, Rob Hersoff says it many times. Where is the Harry Oppenheimer of today? Is there anyone?
Yeah, absolutely valid question. We need, a few people in the private sector to be talking about the kind of economy that will be inclusive enough to give us a stable democracy. And that's where I want the debate to go around the 2024 election. And that's why I feel it is an absolute tipping point in our destiny. Whatever alliances are made between the parties, this is the election where we should be talking about what kind of economy is going to create the kind of hope amongst young people that will allow our democracy to be sustainable without falling into the cautionary tale of a decline towards the wasteland. It's critical right now to start that discussion.
You've been at it for a while along this path. Is anyone listening?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm doing webinars where people ask me to do that, and I'm writing the odd article. But in a sense, it's not like what was going on in 1986-87 when Anglo produced this research, and then I went on the road with two other people, a guy called Jim Bass, who was our economist, and Michael Spicer, who was head of our corporate relations side, and the three of us went around the country giving presentations, which I think really did change the conversation amongst lots of people from saying, "Oh, we're going to have a civil war and it's awful," to maybe there is a high road of negotiation and maybe we can peacefully get back into the world at large. Certainly, the kind of stuff that I've been doing over the last few years hasn't achieved that kind of scale, but I'm just doing my best at my fairly advanced age.
Are you seeing parallels between that time and taking the high road of negotiation
Yeah,
and this time of
absolutely.
entrepreneurship?
I am absolutely seeing parallels in that, you know, our team in the late 80s, particularly Bobby Godsall and Michael O'Dowd, produced a wonderful diagram where they had the choice at the beginning of the diagram was between politically becoming a democracy or going for a kind of artificial system. If you remember, we were going to have a tricameral parliament and parties were going to be co-opted into it. So that was the first crossroads. And we did, thank heavens, take the proper crossroad or the road to negotiation with the real leaders of the country. But they very prophetically had a second crossroads of 10 to 20 years later, where if we didn't achieve the kind of economic growth rates that would be considered successful and obviously get our unemployment down to maybe a level between 5 and 10%, we might well undo all the political progress we've made. And we actually had a circle in our diagram where we kind of went backwards towards a wasteland. And so, yeah, that is exactly where we are now. We are at the economic crossroads for South Africa.
And the path out of it towards the people's economy is based on entrepreneurship and the encouragement of all people, young people, white people, every person to get involved. Am I reading you correctly?
Yeah, well, the point is that there's a couple of things. I feel very strongly that in order to be a winning nation, we've got to have quality infrastructure in terms of our health, our education, electricity, railways, ports, all that kind of stuff. And for me, the flag is whether we're going to see a genuine partnership between government and the private sector in sorting out all these problems, including, of course, Eskom and allowing the private sector to generate part of the electricity that South Africa needs. So that's one huge thing that we have to do. But the second thing is we've got to go flat out on creating this entrepreneurial economy. And yeah, it means that you've got to have a serious support role by big business for small business. But equally, the banks have got to get together and come up with systems whereby they can, have microfinance for small business, because so many banks say it's just too expensive to make very small loans. But they've got to overcome that. That's what they did in Bangladesh with the Grameen Bank. We're going to have to do that here. We should possibly have kind of e-stock exchanges in all the major cities of the country, where you can, like eBay, you can put your business on the site and attract crowdfunding in order to make that business work. And one of the particular points I make is that schools should start teaching kids to be entrepreneur, because they're teaching kids for the future, not for the past. And the fact is, work has changed. In the last century, big businesses created hundreds of thousands of jobs, like the mining industry in South Africa. But those days are gone because of automation and robots and now artificial intelligence. And so the reason why America right now has an unemployment rate of 3.5% is because it is the most entrepreneurial country on earth. People do their own thing. In fact, sometimes they have 2 or 3 businesses or 2 or 3 jobs. And that's how America has an unemployment rate which is at least half of what Europe is. And the flag is that work has changed. And if we want to get our unemployment rate down from the hideous level that it is at the moment, we're going to have to go flat out on allowing young people to become entrepreneurs and encouraging them. And we've had it said in previous discussions, we've got to look at people like Gigi Alcock and others who studied the township economy and see what is it that we can do to take those successful entrepreneurs in the informal sector and grow them into being major players in the formal sector.
So when we come to cast our votes in 2024, we need to be looking at other things, and in particular, this watershed that we're at of supporting or not supporting entrepreneurship. Is there any political party that kind of gets this yet?
I don't think so. That's why, I wrote an article about the DA and how it should rebrand itself. Because, there's nobody who is embracing this concept with a real passion to make it happen. And I don't know, what it's going to take to get people to see it that way. Because, we haven't seen much political discussion on entrepreneurship. I know there's a small business department, and there's even a department which is looking at cutting red tape. But, it actually is probably the most important concept right now. How do we get young people to become successful entrepreneurs as it was in the 80s? How do we extend the vote to everybody? That is something that should be brought out in the campaigning. I don't want just the parties making negative comments about each other. It doesn't inspire people to vote for you. You've got to say, this is what we'll do if we become government. And particularly now, in order to reduce unemployment, you've got to create this entrepreneurial economy.
Clem Sunter, futurist, scenario strategist, national treasure. Lovely talking with you again. I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.